레디언트 에너지 녹음 3일차입니다. 필사는 4일차 만에 끝났는데 녹음을 3일차를 못하고 오늘 4일차에 3일차 거를 하겠습니다.
If America's economy runs hot, what happens to the rest of the world?
If America's economy runs hot, what happens to the rest of the world? What happens to the rest of the world?
When America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold.
When America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold.
But what happens when it runs a fever?
But what happens if it runs a fever?
After a trying 2020 in which GDP fell by 3.5%,
After a trying 2020 in which GDP fell by 3.5%,
America is poised to enjoy a robust rebound in 2021.
America is poised to enjoy robust rebound in 2021
simply by returning to something like normal as vaccination proceeds.
simply by returning to something like normal, as vaccination proceeds.
Yet it might manage more than just that.
Yet it might manage more than just that.
If President Joe Biden's COVID-19 relief bill is enacted,
If President Joe Biden's COVID-19 relief bill is enacted,
total stimulus this year may exceed $2.5 trillion.
total stimulus this year may exceed $2.5 trillion.
That could easily push output above
Above
the Congressional Budget Office estimates to be its potential level.
Above the Congressional Budget Office's estimates of the potential level.
That is, the amount the economy can produce.
That is the amount the economy can produce.
Without an increase in inflationary pressure.
Without an increase in inflationary pressure.
This possibility, as some American economists
This possibility has some American economists
on the lookout for signs of accelerating growth in prices and wages.
On the lookout for signs of growth in accelerating growth in prices and
America
wages.
does not operate in a vacuum, however.
America does not operate in a vacuum, however.
Should
overheating occur,
its effects will not be confined within its borders.
Its effects will not be confined within its borders.
Depending on how the recovery plays out, a hot American economy could be a boon for the rest of the world.
A hot American economy could be a boon for the rest of the world.
Or yet another source of concern. In a closed economy that does not trade with the rest of the world, too little spending leads to job losses and downward pressure on prices.
Too little spending
leads to job losses and downward pressure on prices.
Too little spending leads to price losses and downward pressure on prices.
Whereas too much should push up employment and eventually prices.
Whereas too much would eventually push up prices and employment.
In an open economy, however, some of the effects of the shifts in demand spill over to the rest of the world. A sharp drop in spending, for instance, may be associated with plunging demand for imports. In which case, some of the pain of a slump is exported abroad. During the global financial crisis of 2007 to 9,
after the financial crisis of 2007 to 9,
troubles in financial markets wreaked havoc all over the world. But even countries relatively insulated from those woes felt a chill thanks to trade links with America and Europe. A According to one estimate, about a quarter of the drop in American demand
According to one estimate, a quarter of the drop in American demand
and a fifth of the fall in European demand
and a fifth of the fall in European demand
was borne by other economies and transmitted through trade.
was borne by other economies and transmitted through trade.
A boost to demand ought to work in a similar way, but in the other direction.
A boost in the demand ought to work in a similar way, but in the other direction.
As Americans spend more, some of it leaks abroad.
As Americans spend more, some of it leaks abroad.
Through purchases of foreign goods, for example.
Through purchases of foreign goods, for example.
Or spending on services, including tourism. Which should begin to rebound as pandemic restrictions are lifted. An analysis of fiscal policy spillovers. Published by the IMF in 2017 found that an American stimulus consisting mostly of spending as opposed to tax cuts and
worth 1% of GDP
raises the output of the average country by 0.33% in the first year.
Raises the output of the average country by 0.33% at the end of this year.
Countries with closer trade ties experience bigger effects.
The
fillip to Canada's economy is estimated to be almost 3 times the average, for example. If the combination of reopening and stimulus invigorates the American consumer, the effects could quickly be felt all over the world.
The spillover could quickly be felt all over the world.
The degree to which it is felt, however, depends crucially on the policy response both at home and abroad. Fiscal spillovers are more powerful when recipient countries are themselves operating below potential.
When recipient countries are behaving themselves alone below potential level.
American spending is thus more likely to spill over to the rest of the world.
America's spending is thus more likely to spill over to the rest of the world.
Its recovery is much stronger than those of its trading partners. If its recovery is much stronger than those of its trading partners.
If its recovery is much stronger than those of its weaker partners.
Ordinarily, spillovers provide
strong incentives
for governments to coordinate their stimulus efforts. Lest some tight-fisted economies, for example those in Europe, free ride on the largesse leaking from more generous ones. Indeed, on February 12th, Janet Yellen, America's Treasury Secretary,
the financial ministry secretary.
On February 12th, Janet Yellen, America's Treasury Secretary, urged her counterparts in the G7 group of countries
warned its counterparts among the G7 group of countries to go big on stimulus too.
Countries that free ride could find themselves in hot water with Miss Yellen. The Biden administration has promised to be stern with countries
And Biden administration has promised to be
that
stern
run
with countries
large, persistent trade surpluses.
that run large deficit trade
But
surpluses.
if America does come close to overheating,
But if America does come close to overheating,
then a reluctance to spend elsewhere may be less irksome than usual.
then a reluctance to spend elsewhere would be less irksome than usual,
As demand-starved countries serve as a release valve
as demand-starved countries serve as a release valve
for the pressure building up at home.
for the pressure being built up at home.
Growth in global trade seems to have enhanced its pressure-relieving capabilities.
Growth in global economy seems to enhance its pressure relieving capabilities.
According to work by Jane Eyrig, Stephen Kamin, Deborah Lintner, and Jamie Marquez of the Federal Reserve.
According to work by the Federal Reserve.
They reckon that the expansion in trade has served to weaken the link.
They expect that the expansion in trade.
They reckon that the expansion in trade has served to weaken the link
They reckon that the expansion in trade would weaken the link
between changes in domestic demand and corresponding shifts in total output.
between the changes in domestic demands and corresponding shifting outputs.
That exports bearing more of the burden
That exports bearing more of the burden
of adjustment to changes in domestic spending.
of adjustment to changes in
In the late 1990s, for instance, measures of domestic demand grew even faster
in the late 1990s. For instance, measures of the domestic demand grew even faster
than real GDP, which was itself growing at a rapid clip.
than real GDP, which was itself growing at a rapid clip.
Inflation remained relatively subdued, however, in part
Inflation remained relatively subdued, in part
because America's current account deficit swelled.
because America's current account deficit swelled.
Similarly, a surge in imports this year
Similarly, a surge in imports this year
might dissipate potential inflationary pressures in America
might dissipate potential inflationary pressure in America
while giving a lift to its weaker trade partners.
while giving a lift to its
The biggest
weaker trade partners.
uncertainty about the global effects of a hot American economy
The biggest concern of the global effect of the America's hot economy
is the reaction of the Fed.
is the reaction of the Fed.
Recent work by Kristen Forbes of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology
Recent work by Kristen Forbes of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology
suggests that domestic inflation has become more responsive over time to global factors.
suggests that domestic price changes have become more responsive to global economy over time,
Including the amount of economic slack across the global economy as a whole.
including the global economy slack across all over
Yet
the world.
wage inflation still seems to respond mostly to domestic conditions.
Yet wage inflation seems to be by domestic
The
conditions.
Fed might therefore shrug off price rises later this year,
The Fed might shrug off price rises later this year,
reckoning that short-run price pressures will not translate into sustained inflation.
reckoning that short-run price pressures will not translate into long-term inflation
Until America's job market and the world economy is fully recovered.
until America's job market and the global economy is fully recovered.
A dovish Fed should make for a weaker dollar,
A dovish Fed should make for a weaker dollar.
and easier financial conditions worldwide,
And easier financial conditions worldwide,
adding to the boost that comes from Americans buying more goods from abroad.
adding to the boost coming from Americans from buying more goods
But a really
from all over the world.
But a really rip-roaring economy could test the Fed's patience.
But a really rip-roaring global economy could test the Fed's patience.
Particularly if a yawning current account deficit and soaring asset prices cause it to worry about a build-up of financial risk. The spectre of American interest rate hikes could frighten global markets and force emerging economies to adopt less stimulative fiscal and monetary policies.
A bit of demand
spilling over from America would seem insignificant. A bit of demand spilling over from America would seem insignificant in comparison.
A bit of demand spilling over from America might seem
insignificant in comparison.
A bit of demand coming from American demand might seem insignificant in comparison.
That the Fed will suddenly turn hawkish still seems unlikely. But if America's temperature runs high enough, the rest of the world may break out in cold sweats.
끝났습니다.